everybody. We are having a discussion on the concept of social structure, and I would like to elaborate what is the difference between what is normally called the conflict. As I mentioned in my earlier lecture, I don't like to use that word, and I gave my reasons for the same, and the functionalist. And I just give illustrative evidence. It is not comprehensive at all. Now, if you look at Marx, and I'm quoting from German ideology, he's trying to say that, look, how do we understand social structure? Where should we begin? And he says we begin with real individuals, but we have to look at not what we think about them or the ideas that we have about them, but we have to look at the material conditions under which they live. And all of us live under certain material conditions. We, for example, live in a highly technologically developed material condition. So I'm able to address you without knowing who you are or where you are. And it allows me to reach out. So who I am today, ever since the pandemic with more online classes, is defined by the materiality, the material conditions. The second point, or domain assumption, leading to his understanding of social structure is there is a physical organization. Say today as I'm giving a lecture, I have the camera, I have other people who are helping me, I have people who are timing it, there are others who are there, and of course a very well organized studio which makes this possible. So both physical, materially, technologically as collaborative and organization by people. The third assumption is that by acting on it, here I am not producing by means of subsistence, but I am producing something through technology. In the early years, my ancestors, they would be producing their food and means of subsistence maybe by burning, maybe by the slash cultivation method, maybe by agriculture, using the cow and the plow, maybe by tractor, maybe by factory production. So all of us have to have produced the means of subsistence. If we have excess or surplus, I myself don't have to cultivate my food. I can buy it in a monetized economy. But in all senses, Marx's emphasis is on the individual, human action, production and means of subsistence. The way in which human beings produce the means of subsistence depends first of all on the nature of the actual means of subsistence they find in existence and have to reproduce. So supposing I am born in the 1600s and you would have settled agriculture, you would have the use of widespread use of plow, you may not have the widespread use of fertilizers or pesticides which we have today. So when I am born, I am not only confronted by the language that my family speaks, I am confronted with the actual means of production which exist. And it is upon that changes can be brought about. So this dynamic relationship between the individual and social structure is a constant point in Marx. Now I come back to the point of needs which I had mentioned in my earlier lecture, and that this mode of production that we are talking about must not be considered simply as being the production of physical existence of the individual. So when we say mode of production, it's not just you, me, other people, capitalist, wage worker, which is the usual way you would see Marxism, or the feudal lord or the serf. But it is also a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. I just spent 1 minute on this because it's very important when we talk about domain assumptions and when we use the word ontology. So every theory has a certain ontology or an understanding, a certain idea of what is the human being like. So do we privilege society that the system has certain needs, or do we say individuals have certain needs and those needs have to be met by human action? So the ontological understanding of Marx of human beings is active, laboring individual. And what we do materially to provide for our needs defines of us as human beings, of who we are. It's how we are, a definite mode of life. I am different from somebody who comes from a working class background and who actually works on the field or works in a factory. How we are, how we express our joys. Harvest festival is just something which we do once in a while, very often mediatized. not connected with our everyday life of teaching in a classroom. But for the peasant, it is part of the integral to their definite mode of life every day. The other part of a domain assumption is the relationship between individual and society. What individuals are coincides with the production, both what they produce and with how they produce. The nature of individual thus depends on the material conditions determining the production. I'll give you somehow a trivial example. I come from a generation who studied and grew up and did a PhD and started writing when there was no computer. So pen and paper was the only thing that one could use. And I did it. But today, because I use the laptop or the computer always for my writing, I find it very difficult even to sign a check properly. My skills at writing has got rusted. The material conditions which determine the production sphere within which I live have determined who I am and what we are. Now look at needs as Marx asks, and then I come to Malinowski, one of the early functionalists, one of the pioneers of fieldwork method anthropology. And he says he has a certain kind of privileging to the concept of culture. And he enumerates essential needs of human society and culture, among which are distribution over its locality, defense, maintenance of order, and production of necessaries and values. Look at each of them. Each of these, whose needs are there? Distribution over its locality, defense, maintenance of order. Who decides what is order? Who decides what are necessaries? Who decides what are values? So is society a homogeneous unity? Many of the societies which Malinowski studies, which are called simple societies, were in some senses undifferentiated units. They did not have a very evolved mode of production where you would have the expropriation of surplus. So more people were more like each other. They were roughly doing similar things. Maybe they were not in an exploitative relationship. But even there, the assumption that these are automatic needs which stem from the imperatives of the system need more careful examination. I'm not going to give you an answer. My task is to provoke you to read, think, and figure out, because the role of concept is to think and figure out. Consequently, from this understanding of culture and needs, Malinowski talks about two kinds of needs: primary needs, also called man's animal needs, and needs of the cultural system, where you would have a certain kind of priority to what the cultural needs of a system are. The biological basis of human civilization, Malinowski would argue, that the first essential is the maintenance or equilibrium of cultural system. This was actually critiqued later by fellow structural functionalists like Ratcliffe Brown, because they would argue, how would this prioritization of culture is problematic, because here you're not looking at the structural relationship between individual. The essence of functional method is the explanation of cultural phenomena by their role which they play as particular elements within an integral system of culture. So very often we would argue that Marx is guilty of economic determinism, though he himself rarely uses the word economy, and it is always mode of production. But very often we would also have an assumption that many of the functionalists would have, or later somebody like Parson, an integral system of culture, and I would ask, can they be critiqued of cultural determinism? I'm not going to again give you an answer. You have to figure it out yourself. Now again, going back to how domain assumptions, whether it's from Marx or whether it's from Malinowski or whether it's from Durkheim, is different. Now all of us know the division of labor is pertaining to the social structure. How is this society is divided? Whose role is what? Now the most fundamental of this function in society, Durkheim says, is the division of labor's function of integrating and uniting the societal organism, thereby sustaining its life. So the idea that different sections of society are going to have specific functions and together they will integrate the societal organism. Again, you see the biological organic model, just like I said, the liver and the heart and the kidney. Now, this division of labor is therefore fundamentally geared to the maintenance and survival of individual. If some of you may be already familiar with division of labor, but I would urge you to look at it again and see how that works out. Now, division of labor, he would argue, Durkheim, drives from collective life, is driven by societal needs and sentiments. Now, if you've been following my lecture, you will see that there is a fundamental distinction between the domain assumptions by the critical theorists like Marx and between the functionalists and the structural functionalists. In one, the idea domain assumption of who is the human mind, who human being is a characteristic feature of the human being is laboring, active, working upon nature and thereby creating a certain means of subsistence, leading to a certain kind of mode of production or a social arrangement which includes technology, physical organization and a certain division of labor. Here, instead, there is a certain kind of privileging to the community of beliefs and sentiments which seems to be the driving engine behind it. And all of you are, of course, very much familiar with Durkheim's division of mechanical and organic solidarity and his argument that while mechanical solidarity based on individual similarity was the dominant foundation for sound social bonds in earlier epochs, modern society, according to Durkheim, is bound primarily by organic solidarity, solidarity that arises from individuals' interdependence in the societal division of labor. I don't want to repeat it, but all of you are aware about his emphasis on society as sui generis, that it is much more than a sum of individual. It has a certain kind of characteristic of its own. And a certain emphasis, I've already referred to, of collective consciousness and sentiment, the totality of beliefs and sentiments common to the average members of society forms a determinate system with a life of its own. It can be termed the collective or creative consciousness. Now, social structure and individual needs, that's what I've been trying to tell you, is the social structure here refers to the internal organization of the social whole arising as a byproduct of the functional interdependence of human life. Very, very different from the critical theorist perspective, which is beginning with human action for meeting its need, means of subsistence, creating different kinds of mode of production. Here, it is an internal organization which arises as a byproduct because we are functionally interdependent. But the question from the modern perspective would be, who is functionally interdependent? Who has decided what is interdependent? Now, if you look at Radcliffe Brown, again, I cannot go into any great detail, but his view would be that the natural science is a systematic investigation of the structure of universe as it is revealed to us through our senses. There are separate branches of science, a place for a branch of natural science, which will have for the discovery of the general characteristic of those social structure, of which the component units are human beings. Again, a certain kind of empirical thrust. Empirical thrust was also there in Marx, begin with real empirical, but the problem here is that are we critiquing the ideas that we have to begin with about what we understand structure? So if we look at Radcliffe Brown, he says social phenomena constitute a distinct class of natural phenomena. They are all in one or another connected with the existence of social structure, either being implied in or resulting from there. That social structure is pervasive. The organic analogy, I'm not going to go and repeat it, but the idea that social structure are just as real as our individual organism. It is like the living cell as well as the interstitial fluid. But the organic analogy is dominant, and here is very different from understanding human action. The physiological and psychological phenomena that we observe in the life of organisms are not simply the result of the nature of constituent molecules or atoms of which the organism is built, but are the result of the structure in which they are united. Again, note the word structure in which they are united, integration, balance. Now, here you see the priority of structure. You see an emphasis, and therefore I put those two in blocks: social interaction, social relationship. So very often in standard textbooks you say social structure is the web of social relationship. Absolutely right. But how do we constitute that web of social relationship? Who begins it? Where is human action? Are different people located differentially to these social relations? The functional perspective, therefore, has a domain assumption on solidarity and stability. Now, we've been talking about domain assumptions. Now, if we quite go around and take the example of gender and see how different theories or different kinds of perspective and their domain assumptions make an impact of how we look at gender, how we look at social structure and gender. So, a functional perspective of gender inequality suggests that gender inequalities exist as an efficient way to create a division of labor or a social system in which some of us do certain kind of work and others do different kind of work. In my early lectures on concepts and sociology, I had given an example of the family. So you have person, so the father is the breadwinner and the head of the family and has an instrumental role for the maintenance of the social structure. The woman has an expressive role. She does the caring and the giving. But here her role is different, and together they manage the maintenance of social structure. Most feminist perspectives would be wary of this and would argue, okay, is care an unproblematic category? Who does the care work? In fact, different societies, different kinds of family, the care work would be done very differently. So, if I belong to a middle class family who has extra access to hiring the domestic labor of some other woman of some other family, then the care work is dependent upon my access to resources. In other words, my location in a particular class, caste or race. Why race? Take the example of domestic workers. Large number of women migrate from Latin America or South America to the United States as domestic worker. At one point from Sri Lanka, from Bangladesh, even from India, where they would go to the Middle East or sometimes even to the global north. Now, these people are not doing care work as expressive. Now, you see the word care. The assumption is you're doing it out of love. Indeed you are, but along with it there is a hidden pressure. Who can afford to have those expressive abilities and who is forced? I know, and I'm sure many of you know, of this young woman who had to leave her baby with her sister in order to earn extra money so they could buy a plot of land. So 2 years she could not see her child. So is care a common sense concept or is care a sociological concept? And today when people use the word care work, it has a different dimension where it is trying to argue that this too is work, very often for wages. Now, the functionalist perspective, gender is a logical basis for organization in society. There is a direct connect between biology and social role. The story would be that in different sections of society, this biological difference between men and women were given, and it was a result of biological programming. Women had to look after children. It was a logical base and an efficient way of organization. I've already referred to Talcott Parsons' instrumental and expressive. I have used this example of the family in great detail in my earlier lectures in this series on concepts in sociology. You can have a look at that. But if I look back and say, is division of labor also a division of property? Because the argument of Marx would be not that the division of labor is the best and the most efficient way of maintaining the system. But the argument would be the division of labor is also a division of property. What labor I do depends upon what kind of property access that I have. So if I have the privilege of sitting here and giving a lecture, it is my labor. It is dependent upon what you would call cultural capital, or other kinds of capital, which equips me with this kind of division of labor. So if you look back at the functionalist description, the argument in the ancient times that there was a natural propensity for gender division of labor, and even in the most tribal form of ownership, Marx's argument would be a little different, arguing that these would be not in the same way differentiated, but there would be a certain division existing within the family, and very often that division of labor existing within the family would be gendered. The social structure here is therefore limited to an extension of the family. Patriarchal family chieftains, below them members of the tribe, finally slaves. The slavery latent in the family, Marx argues, develops gradually with the increase of population, the growth of wants, and with the existence of external relations, both of war and barter. Now, the division of labor suggests, if we look at the functionalist perspective, that there is a certain kind of fixity. This is what I'm supposed to do. This is what my mother did, my grandmother did. This is what, a serf or bonded laborer's father did and a mother did, and therefore it is fixed. A slave child's mother or father did. But as soon as this distribution of labor comes to being, each man or woman has a particular exclusive sphere of activity which is forced upon him or her and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. This is, of course, a quote from German ideology. How do we unfix the division of labor, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes? Society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for him or her to do one thing today and another thing tomorrow, so that I can perhaps fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or critic. This again brings up to the question of structure and individual free choice. How are we prisoners of the social structure within which we are? And what is the role of consciousness or idea? I'm going to sort of wind up my lecture taking the example of the housewife. And this is a very famous book by Anne Oakley. It is called The Housewife, The Sociology of Housework. And through this lens of the concept of housewife and housework, I want to look at the concept of social structure. Now, if you look at the functionalist domain assumption, it would begin in this fashion, that you have a structure, and the structure has certain imperative needs. How does the structure maintain itself? It has to maintain itself. There would be mayhem. It is going to break apart. There is going to be anomie if the structure is not reproduced and maintained. And a very efficient way of that maintenance is to have gender-based division of labor. Men do certain kind of things, women do certain kind of things. So role, individual role, is also part of division of labor and structure, and this all adds up to social structure. Now, can we understand social structure and without understanding what is our own consciousness to it? Do we see it natural? Do we see it naturally, or do we see it historical? Is it different in different kinds of societies? When we have different images in advertisement of the new woman, is her role different from her mother or grandmother? When we see an advertisement of a man taking care of babies, changing the diapers of a baby, is his role changing? If it is so, what kind of society is it? How did this change come about? And here, the role of culture and ideology become extremely important. extremely important. Common sense, experience, living in the kind of patriarchal society that we do, we think it's natural for men to do certain kind of work, women to do certain kind of work. We think it's natural for men not to be so organized in the homes and women to be very organized within the home. It is natural for men to be messy and incompetent in the kitchen. The woman should be a kind of master or a miss chef in the kitchen and a super mom or super wife or super boss. Now, this culture and ideology make it easier for us to accept a Parsonian, structural functionalist understanding of gender division of labor. And if, on the other hand, we bring in questions of power, hierarchy, then we may be a little more uneasy about it and say, is it really natural? And when we say, is biology not important? Is it not important that women are biologically supposed to have children, are supposed to breastfeed them, are supposed to look after them? Indeed, they are. But is it done in the same way in all society? Or does this historical structure change? At one point in feudal India, in a caste-based feudal India, very often the dai, who looked after, who was the midwife, living in privileged, so to say, upper caste families, would deliver the baby and would often also breastfeed the baby. Now, here is a biological act, but what you notice is that there are hierarchies of caste and class which intermingle. The same was true in America during slavery, where very often you would have a black slave woman looking after the women, the white children of the privileged family within which she was a worker. Whenever we think of the family, if we belong to a privileged group, we think of our family. And we are unable to look at society in a comparative and in a hierarchical perspective. But the role of concepts is precisely to debunk the social science the common sense assumptions that we have about social structure and the family, and in fact look at it from a kind of debunking perspective, a historical approach which looks at the primacy of activity and labor, and which looks at the role of division of labor as also division of property. So in my presentation, what I was trying to do, if I very quickly sum up, one, distinguish between lay concept, common sense concept, and sociological concept. Not an easy task, because some concepts in sociology are closer to our lay concepts. And therefore, we find it personally a little uncomfortable to accept that if we belong to particular sections of society. The others, who are more invisible, who theory has not taken into account, for example, that the story of the dai in the family social structure, or the black woman in a slave society in the family structure of the white family, then we need concepts, historical approach, and a comparative perspective to shake up these common sense concepts. The third point is that we have to see the link between different levels of social structure. Division of labor, also division of property, makes us look at society completely different. The whole idea is that concepts are a revelatory mechanism. Thank you very, very much for this opportunity.